Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is May 30th, 2018. Season 9, F5, anybody who's picky. Tonight, a big question in reality. The more you look into it, the bigger it gets. Is there a viable environment or economy with post-truth conservatism? You know, you remember how everybody was always told that as time went on, humanity would get smarter. Now that we can record everything we do in such detail and totality, all this data going to lead to some improvements? Tired of waiting for that? Do you sense maybe it's not really getting closer? Post-truth conservatism, practice that's a force to be reckoned with. Throw in the identity politics tactics, and we may have ushered in the science of confusion. Quite time. Moral science has a net positive impact on societies and institutions. Education, science, public safety, environment, economics, sociology, they're all supposed to get better. Science. Now, place that concept. It's even hard to read about, you know? It's just so for real. Ideology-based politics combined with tribal mindset delivered by PostTruth Media to an ever-increasingly fractured public leads to pretty much exactly what we have. Corporations write laws. Psychological campaigns groom the citizen to maintain consent. Dissent is treason, exposure is criminal, and the flag waves in the breeze. So what's the long-term impacts of this stuff? Well, The View Up Here welcomes back Graham Chivers to discuss these issues. An advocate of science-based policy, Graham seeks greater public safety and a healthy environment for everyone by applying forensic design analysis. He seeks to deliver insights on risks where no paper trail likely exists. Graham is a mechatronics expert with over 25 years of design technology and advanced manufacturing experience. It's been a while, Graham. Welcome back to The View Up Here.
Thank you very much, Glenn. It's great to be back.
Well, it's good to have you. I mean, this is a macro question for society, is it not? The co-opting of science has a great price to pay, does it not?
Well, absolutely. To be able to get the truth is an important thing. And, I'd just like to say thank you very much for providing this platform for people to speak about these topics. And these topics typically do not get covered in our media. And we saw the trend, and as you said, here we are now, and we're looking down the barrel of post-truth conservatism and how it impacts our lives. The science accomplished in Canada makes big waves all around the world. Canada has invested in a better tomorrow. We've invested in education and science. But however, over the past few decades, Canada's scientists and experts are quietly being ignored on critical matters. What we see now is post-truth conservatism at play. Over time, it has evolved into a big risk for Canada, our environment, and our economy. It's a risk at both the federal and the provincial level. And post-truth conservatism is demonstrating that it is unable to deliver ethical science-based policy, and it is unable to deliver beneficial economic sectors. The more we learn, the more we see that it also lacks basic moral authority. Each day, science delivers new discoveries and improved ways to do things. Science can make improvements in many ways. Tonight I'll try to focus on our environment and the economy. I chose these two perspectives because I think everyone sees the value in a strong economy and a healthy environment. Both a strong economy and environment are possible, but it will take teamwork to get there. But when post-truth conservatism is thrown into the game, we all suffer the results. There are huge global markets where Canada can deliver solutions that help both our economy and our environment. Mark Carney estimated that the green economy is worth $250 trillion to the year 2050. I think Mark is aiming low. I estimate this market at $350 trillion. These are massive market opportunities. And these are opportunities that post-truth conservatism will fight and fail to capitalize on. Canada has always been a science heavyweight. We have some huge successes, and we have some mega failures. You have to take the good with the bad. Time and performance determines these successes or failures, and post-truth conservatism fails to deliver winning economies or a safe environment. In order for conservatism to benefit Canada, it first must respect our oath of office and represent all voters. And if it continues as it is, post-truth conservatism will continue to devolve into a dangerous and harmful blight on our democracy, our nation, our national security, and our economy. Canada is a leader in quantum technology, neuroscience, mental health, artificial intelligence, military technology, mining, healthcare, medicine, psychology, education, and the list goes on. Canada also leads in scientific literacy. And Canada is a preferred place to conduct research and development. We have the brains, we have good healthcare, excellent education, and we have safe communities. The sad reality is that if we can't benefit from the science or make money from it, all these efforts are wasted. Canada was a sitting duck when Stephen Harper began quietly muzzling scientists. Now we are witnessing the Trump attack on science in America. It does seem that America is better suited to recognize and fight back to protect the national security of the science community. The more it grows, the more dangerous post-truth conservatism becomes. Trump didn't invent fake news. Post-truth conservatism has slowly been emerging over the past 30 years to what we are witnessing in Canada today, also Australia and the UK. This latest culture of Republican identity politics that defines the conservative brand is based on ideology and lacks critical thought. After 9/11, PostTruth Media blossomed into mainstream media. I remember watching Fox News Detroit and then switching to CBC and noticing the stark difference in the 9/11 coverage. Fox News has always given safe harbor to extreme opinion and analysis. And today, Fox is hand in hand with Donald Trump, just as some Canadian media are hand in hand with Scheer, Ford, and your friend Jason Kenney. Stephen Harper imported this conservative brand to Canada. Some of our news outlets have migrated to the Fox News formula of this dumbed-down psychological warfare on weak minds and constantly throwing red meat to his hungry base. Now we have journalists that focus solely on this brand of the sky is falling journalism. To feed the base is a daily menu of fear and misinformation. This faux outrage media machine has now become a big tent that grooms minds on a rainbow of conservative identity politics and conspiracies. The fake news fabricates these narratives, and these narratives support the identity politics. Bush said, "You are either with us or against us." In reality, issues are much more complex than yes, no, left, right, or good or bad. We do not live in a binary world. It's a complex world. It's analog. The closer we look at issues, the more complex they become. Post-truth conservatism has two main objectives: distract and feed the base, and two, and this is the big one, it enables stakeholders to dictate the terms and conditions. Corporations and special interest groups now determine economic strategy and, as we see, write the laws to favor themselves, not the greater public. As a designer, I have been involved in projects that are highly and aggressively defended from espionage. There simply are details the public never needs to know. And this sanctuary is where post-truth conservatism can hide its secrets, game the legal system, and get what it wants. There's no requirements for some paper trails in corporations. And I think that, the process of privatization has really, worked against the public as far as transparency. So some people, tout the free market economy and privatization, but typically what is advertised doesn't actually happen. What we see is alternative things going on that didn't really meet the original description, shall we say. The latest version of post-truth conservatism only requires voters to follow a few simple constructs: us versus them, smaller government, lower taxes, and freedom, freedom, freedom. The post-truth brand sticks to these oversimplified constructs. It enables its low information base to quickly identify ideological threats and defend against them with debunked jabberwocky and ancient thinking. Post-truth conservatism has groomed its own media, its own think tanks, its judges, and its own brand of identity politics. It's morphed into a big machine. From the outside, post-truth conservatism looks stupid and easy to deconstruct, and it is. If we look at Daniel Dale's Twitter feed, we can see Daniel dedicating his time to debunking Trump's junk. Seems to be like a 24-hour job. I don't know if Daniel wanted to pursue this career or not, but what a horrible place to be. So from the outside, it looks big and stupid, but when we look closer, post-truth conservatism is actually a heavily funded and sophisticated system of political deception and propaganda. Post-truth conservatism has big money, and it uses it Mega donors are the big winners. Corporations join forces to maintain the status quo and pressure government to always get their way. Industry groups are formed, dictate the laws, and politicians look the other way. Post-truth conservatism doesn't present superior solutions. Its purpose is to get politicians elected so corporations can write the laws, and also unleash the sandcastle politics that fits the post-truth conservatism identity politics. This big machine erases all progress. It eliminates accountability and stacks the deck in their favor. When things go to court, post-truth conservatism has already groomed the details and the good fellows that will take one for the team. If we take a step back, moral science has a net positive impact on our institutions and society. I use the term moral science for a reason. There is also dangerous science and inferior science. The term moral science refers to the best policy that benefits society. An example of dangerous science would be using plutonium to kill your dandelions. An example of inferior science would be choosing to use negative reinforcement on children rather than positive reinforcement for education. One way works better than the other. We should be picking the smarter way. As science evolves, hundreds of new science papers are published daily. Well, currently, there are about 120 million science papers available online. Now, some science is strong, some science is weak. And with new discoveries come new questions about currently accepted science. It does deliver a steady stream of discovery. The science that may have been preferred on Tuesday may be replaced with superior science on Wednesday. As a scientist, one must be able to toss old ideas in the recycling bin and move forward with the better ideas. To get an even bigger perspective picture, the Higgs boson experiment was repeated successfully 750 trillion times, staggering number of repetitions. Why? Why did they do it 750 trillion times? Well, science rarely delivers 100% certainty. The certainty of the Higgs boson is not 100%. Science requires us to qualify the results. There's a plus minus on these things. And some people exploit this wiggle room to discredit or question the validity of the science itself. We see that with climate change. Now, in a court of law, an informed physicist would deny that the Higgs boson exists with 100% certainty. There is a probability it doesn't exist. And if you don't understand that math, you lack the critical thought skills to make an informed determination on the Higgs boson. Does Andrew Scheer deny the existence of the Higgs boson? Well, some politicians in Canada deny climate change science. Funny, Andrew has not commented on the Higgs boson, probably because it doesn't impact his business stakeholders, but climate sure does. It seems the science that some choose to deny is the science which conflicts with their ideology or worldview. In short, any science that undermines or questions post-truth conservatism is politicized and weaponized, no matter the results, even if these choices harm human life, diminish human rights, or poison our environment. The risk of censoring or denying new science is dangerous because it impacts our everyday lives and our institutions, such as education, public safety, our healthcare, our prison systems, our mental health care system, our public works, our environment, and, of course, our economy. Stephen Harper censored science at the federal level. But what about science censorship at the provincial level? Do Ontario, Alberta, and New Brunswick now face the specter of Republican identity politics provincially? While politics and science should never mix, policy is the best method to deliver reliable and moral results. When politics politicizes science, how does that impact decision-making at the provincial level? Well, here's a hint. It's a negative impact. A recent example of this, aside from the looming UNDRIP repercussions, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline and oil sands. How well is that industry performing? It looks like a failure to me. These tax-funded mega projects should deliver profitable operations, deliver quality jobs, and benefit voters. As we see, oil sands is still heavily subsidized. It's still polluting. If we end fossil fuel subsidies, what is the true cost of production? Well, good luck on finding that out. And what was once fringe conservative thinking has now become mainstream. It's like a cult mindset. As post-truth conservatism culture grows, it leverages its oversimplistic bipolar reasoning to quickly debunk modern progress. New science that contradicts Republican identity politics is quickly labeled with weak ideological reasoning, and it lacks critical thought. If a Republican is confused, they can simply pick and choose from A, George Soros, B, Agenda 21, C, postmodern Marxism, D, feminism, C, multiculturalism, etc., etc. There's no critical thought behind this culture. Critical thinking and reasoning is absent. If we look at Fox News, it has evolved since Clinton. When 9/11 happened, Fox News went into overdrive to support the Bush-Cheney agenda. When Obama took over office, the tone flipped. Republicans and the media started playing the blame game. 1 month into office, the Tea Party was christened and heavily funded. This isn't grassroots, it's AstroTurf. When Benghazi happened, Fox News began fabricating and blaming rather than discussing the Republican decision to weaken embassy security. These narratives are built up and repeated again and again. To this day, Republicans believe these narratives as facts, even when confronted with the facts. And we see the same game being played in Canada as Justin Trudeau scurries to manage the tire fire that was designed to burn. Phoenix is a good example. Those that proudly label themselves as fiscal conservatives should be embarrassed that CPC couldn't deliver a working payroll software. CPC is now using the Republican blame game. It's one part politics, one part media, and one part oblivious. In 2001, I called Fox News faux news, FAUXNEWS. I worked for almost a decade in America, so some in Canada couldn't really see this coming. In 2011, I tweeted the term fake news when discussing Stephen Harper in some Canadian media outlets. The media is a key ingredient in post-truth conservatism. It's also a tool that conservatism understands how to gain wealth. Dick Cheney did not leave a paper trail. We witnessed how the Harper government used these same tactics to thwart media from reporting content that was traditionally available. We saw the use of legal muzzles, threatening lawsuits, overclassifying content as matters of national security, or hiding facts behind the cloak of trade secret and using insulated court systems to maintain the damage if there was any. Post-truth conservatism knows how to avoid accountability and deny ownership. The result is see you in court culture. They never admit error, they never take ownership, and they threaten others with lawsuits. Post-truth conservatism is a well-designed machine. For some missions, there are mountains of dark money primed to keep the torches burning. It's a well-crafted formula of psychological operation. It has lots of money to burn on the weak-minded, and it works. The same psyops that were once used on foreign targets are now being used on citizens. When the wars are about money and power, it doesn't matter where they are waged. The object is to win at all costs. One of these costs is the diminished Canadian media. It has devolved into a news desert. This same Republican formula is being applied in Canada. There's lots of advertising money for post-truth content providers and plenty of cash to feed the post-truth kingpins in the Canadian media. Canada is a small news market, and it seems the big players have a monopoly on the published content. With conservative politicians and senators providing the talking points, the groomed media delivers the message to the groomed base. Some stories have never been told in our media, but now there are even less. The media landscape in Canada has suffered since Harper led the charge against journalism. The CRTC thwarted some attempts, but the machine simply found another way to deliver its post-truth payload. Corporations armed with advertising dollars fed those that would comply with the content. Local news is mostly gone. I mean, who even knows what is going on in Manitoba with its conservative government? Can you take a guess? Well, you probably have to. One objective of post-truth conservatism is to flood the news landscape to distract from the news that matters. There is hope. There has been the emergence of grassroots media that is bravely reporting on issues that are simply never covered by today's current media. For example, your show, your podcast. But also, I see the National Observer, as an excellent source for basic journalism. They do a good job of covering the issues, but they also face the ugly side of post-truth conservatism culture, and that's direct harassment. I got my first death threat online before the year 2000, and many since. It came from far-right groups in America, but now we see the same murder culture in Canada. Post-truth conservatism is dangerous. While fomenting hate and fear, sometimes its fringe extremists can incite domestic terrorism. For some that suffer from mental health issues, this hate and fear, as some write off as strong politics, is harming people and costing lives. Unfortunately, I predicted that CPC's culture would eventually incite violence in Canada. Sadly, I was correct. And when we take a step back from this, what would it change the mind of a post-truth conservative, or anyone for that matter? And it was interesting. I was reading a science paper published by Sam Harris, and they conducted an experiment like this. The study was performed to measure people's ability to change their minds when faced with counter evidence. Researchers were interested in seeing how or if people could change their minds, while researchers were directly observing specific regions in the participant's brain with modern brain scanning methods. The study presented both political and non-political statements to the participants, and they would either agree or disagree on each statement. Depending on the opinion, the researchers would then pose an additional 5 counter-evidence statements contradicting the participant's opinion, and then ask the participant if that changed their opinion on the original statement. For example, one of the political statements was, quote, taxes on the wealthy should generally be increased, end quote. And an example of a non-political statement was, taking a daily multivitamin improves one's health. So while they were going through these questions, researchers were scanning the brains of the participants and recording the brain region activity during the entire process. This study is complex, but what it illustrates is that when faced with counter evidence, people more often change their opinions on non-political issues than they will on political ones. What they observed is that political statements incited more emotional activity and resistance to change. People strongly identify with certain political beliefs, and the researchers could observe these different brain patterns. So what does it take to change the mind of a post-truth conservative on political beliefs? When they're presented with the hard science, times see people doubling down on the denial of that science. If these people also lack the scientific literacy skills, they also lack the ability to perform the critical thinking on these subjects. When it comes to climate change, this body of understanding is far beyond the comprehension of folks that deny it, but it's also beyond the scope of some people that support it. Understanding climate change is really hard. It's harder than Einstein's stuff. It's certainly harder than Darwin's evolution. So we need to trust scientists when they give us this information. Those that trust science typically support the science they do not fully understand. For myself, I trust Lee Smolin on physics. I don't know the physics that Lee Smolin does, but when Lee Smolin publishes a paper, I trust him. The same goes with Steven Pinker's Science on Language. I am not a language expert, but when Steven Pinker publishes a study and it's peer-reviewed, I tend to trust the work. There are many complex issues that science struggles to communicate to the public. I mentioned climate, but there's also gender science and best methods for mental health support. We need to trust what science teaches us, but we also need to understand the limitations of the science itself. To wrap this up, as the saying goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Now, you asked me to send you some articles, and I included some from both America and Canada. Did you want to summarize some of the American stuff?
Absolutely. I just wanted to alter your final statement there a bit. You can lead a horse to water, but it's damn hard to hold their head under. That's the way I generally refer to it these days. Just reflection on a couple things there. When you were talking about what I got out of it is everything's monetized. Everything. Absolutely everything. It doesn't matter if it's a cure for cancer. If I can't make any money on it, find something else. It's just obscene. And the way I think it's important when you said there that a lot of science is harder and harder all the time to get across to the general public so they actually can get a layman's understanding of what the issue is. And it's very easy to paint it in the binary fashion by the post-truth conservative crowd. And they're really good at that. Ooh. Did you hear that?
No.
Okay. We seem to be okay now. Okay. Yeah, as you said, you did send me some articles that really demonstrate. And one of the last things you mentioned there was, again, the suppression. How governments seem to be aware that if the people know this stuff, they may catch on. So let's try and keep it quiet. And one thing that I want to point out is an article that appeared in Scientific American. At the end of the last couple of years of the Obama administration, the NOAA National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States was compiling data for a big sea level rise report. One of the first things the Trump government did was prevent that from being released. The report was delayed for a year under quote-unquote administrative review. And basically it was just sat on. The top, Maria Caffrey is from the University of Colorado Boulder, a researcher who led the study. She plans to file a scientific integrity complaint. And she said censorship is a good word for what has been done to the report. Now, of course, this is from the Department of Interior, where Secretary Zinke has already established quite a pattern of behavior. The Secretary said no political staff was involved in editing the report, and he wants an investigation into how journalists obtained the draft before it was given to agency headquarters. There's a little bit of a difference in message there, but we're not going to pay attention to that. And this is a study. When you look at the data, the news is not good. Sea level is rising much quicker than previously expected. I mean, we've seen Katrina, what happened there. We saw what happened in the Caribbean just last year. It's an issue. So I guess if you try and prevent data, then you don't have to talk about it. You don't have to defend why you're ignoring it. Another thing that's very important to people pretty much east of the Continental Divide is the Great Lakes. I had some relative, just open numbers here about the Great Lakes. I'm going to throw these out while I got the minute. For the biggest bodies of fresh water in the world by surface area, Lake Michigan and Huron is number 1 in the world. Lake Superior is number 2 in the world. Lake Erie is number 8 in the world, and Lake Ontario is number 10 in the world. Now, this is the drinking water source for close to 40 million people.
Yeah.
And yet, what was one of the first things that Trump decided that we could cut that? It was Great Lakes cleanup funding.
Yeah.
Now, his proposed 2019 budget for the EPA would cut funding by 90% for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and a similar program for Chesapeake Bay, which is the United States' largest estuary, in Virginia. It will remove all EPA funding of cleanup programs for the Gulf of Mexico, Lake Champlain, Long Island Sound, San Francisco Bay, Puget Sound, and South Florida, including the Everglades and Keys. Well, you look at all those areas, Gulf of Mexico, well, we know what that's about, the blowout. Lake Champlain, Katrina, Long Island Sound, I forget the name, hurricane in New York. I forget the name. I just drew a blank. San Francisco Bay is having ridiculous sea level rises. Puget Sound the same. South Florida is sinking. Everybody knows it. And this is what he wants to cut 90% of funding from. Why? To hide science. And then, in Trump's first year, the science advice to the executive of the U.S. government has fallen off a cliff. Fewest members and less meetings at any time since 1997. Why 1997? Because that's when they started taking these statistics. So this is the lowest of all time. 200 science panels. There are just boards and boards of experts that are mandated, that are empty, because apparently science does not work in Trump's post post-truth conservative world. Then you talked about how science is a global community in a big way. It takes, like you said, you have reputations from international scientists and you trust them because of their body of work. That also works with institutions, and it also works with nations. And Canada, as you said, has a great reputation.
Yeah.
Of course, everybody remembers Trump's travel bans. Well, the people that were getting banned were people who already had status, and most of them were there because they were in education, medicine, or science. So with Trump's travel ban,
and now a lot of
go ahead.
Now a lot of people are avoiding America completely. Corporations are leaving America because it's too hard for them to, do global work when they have scientists from other countries coming to visit and collaborate and work with and exchange ideas. And this is a really narrow-minded thinking. And Canada has benefited from this. When Trump won office, I predicted scientists would be coming to Canada to escape the, to escape this scourge. And it really is a scourge. Under the Bush administration, there was a shakedown in some scientific fields of study in the United States. I mean, there was sex research, there was genetics research, there was, research on women, women's science. All of these things were impacted, and you have to ask why. And basically, science delivers results. It delivers facts, and these are inconvenient facts for some. You had mentioned, sea level rise. The sea level rise will impact 80% of the trade cities globally. The first group in the United States to send out signals about sea level rise was the Pentagon, because the Pentagon can't maintain a naval or nuclear fleet when they have to change their facilities to overhaul and house all of these ships. They can't run an effective program when sea level rise is messing up all their equipment and ruining their, if the level of water goes up a couple of inches, that's a big deal when it comes to, how to, service a nuclear submarine or something. So the Pentagon, they basically, led the charge on all of this stuff. And sea level rise is going, as you said, is going to affect, Florida. But it also puts at risk about 100 nuclear reactor sites in the States. And it also puts at risk, I think it's 10 or 12 nuclear reactors in the UK. So when we see this post-truth conservatism, it's not just in America and Canada, it's also in the UK and Australia. We hear the same, anti-climate, anti-science, anti-everything. It's like a cult. And anything that, undermines the cult is, as I said, weaponized and politicized. It's bad. One of the other things about the Great one of the things about the Great Lakes is plastic, microplastic pollution. There's more microplastic pollution in the Great Lakes than is in the oceans. We also see the effects of, farming on Lake Erie. And, all of these realities are inconvenient truths to big businesses in America that are making these messes. So by changing the law, by denying the science, by playing these games, they basically absolve themselves from responsibility of these very real threats. And, eliminating 80% of global trade cities is bad for economics. Real bad.
Well, I mean, it just seems to me, it's almost become cliche. It's been sold as cliche by those who are opposed to it. But the simple statement of there is no 21st century economy without a viable environment. That is the truth.
Yeah. That's that's the reality is that all of it and we talked about science, but there's also a science of accountability of drug manufacturers in the States. The FDA used to be a really tight ship, but since big money got involved and changing the laws and stuff, now we have drugs, the opiate-based drugs on the market. They knew a lot of these outcomes before it hit the market. So who's pulling the levers on these decisions? And when you think about it, discovering new drugs is a huge risk. There's a lot of money. And, the executives are just not going to take no for an answer. And they go back to the government and say, well, you're just going to put all these people out of jobs, You're hurting my business, by forcing us to do these extra experiments. It's just not fair, And it's really, this science is to protect the people. It's there to do a particular job. And I wanted to focus tonight on the environment and the economy, but science impacts all of these different levels of our society. When we faced the ozone depletion, the ozone hole, some American businesses were really upset when scientists determined that the product or the production of a certain chemical must stop. And for freedom-breathing corporations, having government say you can't do that was just simply unacceptable. The same science that supported an innovative America became a risk for some business models. Some companies began to form special interest groups, and they would lobby against laws that impacted their business models. They changed the laws rather than addressing the root cause and eliminating the problems. It's a lazy solution. The NRA dictated no science on guns. Now there's no science on climate. There's no science on some health care. And now, they're talking about weakening consumer protection laws. As I said, sea level rise will put the U.S. and U.K. nuclear reactors at risk. One of them is just upstream from New York City. A Fukushima-scale disaster in the New York region would be a tragedy and an economic disaster. So why is American media not discussing these issues? Let's face it, there's great risk in these new designs, these new projects. It can cost billions of dollars if it fails, but if it succeeds, it can make tons of money and create high-paying jobs. Products can also fail to sell, they can fail to work, they can also fail to make it to market. When Elon Musk took on the Tesla 3, Elon quickly learned that big manufacturing is not easy. Hey, Elon, call me. Gram for gram, Canada is a global science leader. Science is like a machine, and each day it pops out new stuff, new ideas, new technology, and new theory. It's what drives innovation, and it's what leads to superior methods and smarter economies. But science also delivers the facts. But what about when these facts disrupt an established monopoly market? Well, there's a conflict. When new facts identify a better way to teach children, or a better way to treat people with mental health issues, or better ways to generate energy that eliminates pollution, who stands to lose? There are businesses that will lose if they don't innovate. Now, they choose not to innovate, and they pay the price. You know, we're learning, how we treat prisoners is wrong. We're learning that, punishing children harms them. How do our systems change to accommodate these new facts? And there's going to be resistance from the status quo. When these new findings emerge, we need to identify the good stuff and then toss out the bad stuff. And I'll say it right now, I personally challenge Stephen Harper to present repeatable empirical evidence that equine therapy delivers the best outcome per tax dollar spent on veterans' mental health care. There is no evidence. These things, the ideologies are not supported by evidence. Conservatism is ideology first, and science, if it conflicts with the ideology, is ignored. We talked about some of the American examples, but there's plenty of examples in Ontario. I sent you some. Did you want to discuss the evolution of the Ontario energy market?
I certainly can do that. For people in Ontario, not only do you have this interesting campaign going on currently, but also something that's been in and out of the news for the last couple years now has been the state of the nuclear power industry in Ontario. But as when we were discussing putting this episode together, gee, what a surprise. Where did this stuff start? Well, this stuff started back with none other than Mike Harris. And there was a fundamental change in electricity at every level when Harris was in power. I mean, things weren't so bad, up through the 60s and into the 70s. In the 70s, all of Ontario's power systems were on one synchronized grid, with the exception of remote communities. In 1973, the Ministry of Energy was created with the specific mandate to manage the province's electricity system. In 1974, Ontario Hydro was born, a crown corporation governed by a board of directors. Its mandate was not to generate profits or pay taxes, but provide energy at cost. Between 1977 and 1989, Ontario went nuclear. Bruce Station, later Darlington, the building of these plants gave Ontario Hydro a debt at that time of $38.1 billion, which caused rates to go up sharply for the first time. In 1992, Ontario Hydro faced a downturn in the economy, but the demand-supply plan that they had was not implemented. Despite a downturn in the economy, Ontario power rates go up 40%. The next year, the government freezes them, and they stay that way for nearly a decade. So you think about that just for a second. A 40% increase that was granted by government of the day is frozen after a year. There's no increase in 10 years. And somehow Ontario Hydro wasn't bitching and complaining for more money? That 40% worked for 10 years, but they wanted it all up front. In 1995, the MacDonald Committee was created to advise on electricity competition and provide recommendations. In 1998, the Energy Competition Act authorized the restructuring of Ontario Hydro and the eventual opening of wholesale and retail electricity markets. Now, the Energy Competition Act is the beginning of what we have today. That was 1999. Ontario Hydro was broken into 5 separate companies. OPG, Ontario Power Generation. They generate and compete with other smalling generating companies. Ontario Hydro Services, which became Hydro One. commercial company that owns and maintains transmission and distribution. Independent market operator, which later became the Independent Electricity System Operator, a Crown corporation responsible for directing the flow of electricity across the network. I think just about every jurisdiction's got one of them. The Electrical Safety Authority, which was basically the PR side, and the Ontario Electricity Financial Corporation, a Crown agency charged with managing the $38.1 billion debt from going nuclear and other liabilities. So even at their formation, there was a $19.4 billion stranded debt. And there's no other way for that debt to get paid down by any accounting trick except increasing rates to the consumer. In 2002, the market opened. In 2003, all the screams started for we need a new transmission network. In 2004, the Electricity Restructuring Act passed, which was supposed to encourage new supply, promote conservation, and provide stable prices. Where have we heard that before?
Hey.
You know, through the first decade of the 2000s, nothing was really fixed. Nothing was improved. More money was spent, but not much else was done, which sounds an awful lot like BC, which sounds an awful lot like Alberta, which was recently ended. But between 2006 and 2011, Ontario had 45% nuclear generation, 34% natural gas, 6.7% coal power. But come 2014, 63% nuclear and natural gas, pretty much unchanged, down a bit, 29% renewables, and no coal. So, I mean, they did get some progress done, but the Green Energy Act in 2009 is where a lot of people say that the Liberal government of the day gave away the store. And, you know, from what we've seen from the Auditor General in Ontario, and, you know, it's been long enough now, it's been pretty much a decade, the evidence is in, and it was a giveaway. Again, reminds me very much of BC Power. And it's become a huge issue right up to this election. I understand the fear of sticking to what the Green Energy Act was intended to do with the FIT program, but they should have learned from their mistakes and kept applying it, should they have not? Because now what do we see they have done? One word, Darlington.
Oh, yeah, Darlington. Well, I mean, basically, Ontario got out of the energy games in 1998, you know, and basically handed over the design authority to not the government, let's just say, to private corporations, to lobbyists. You know, the plan itself, the premise of competition in a small market like Ontario, it doesn't work like the United States. Like, the privatization models in small markets don't really deliver what they intended. You know, the Energy Competition Act was Mike Harris promised lower costs and more reliability. You know, the Ontario energy market has, you know, its pluses and its minuses. I mean, let's face it, operating a large energy grid is not easy. You know, flicking a light switch is easy, plugging in a device is easy, but delivering energy to each customer in Ontario is a challenge. You know, our energy market is constantly evolving and growing, and we have to consider new technology, cleaner solutions, and also the cost of new energy. When we turn on the lights, the energy could be from many different sources.
And each energy source used in Ontario's energy portfolio has specific requirements, costs, benefits, and risks. I decided to focus on Darlington, the Darlington nuclear power plant as an example, just because it has a very high science-based definition, to evaluate the project itself. Science operates not only at the design level of a nuclear reactor, but also its operation, its performance, and its cost. Science can be applied at many levels to better understand the risks and costs of operating these systems. We have tritium spills, we have nuclear waste measures, we have security overhead costs, system redundancy requirements for operation safety, we've got materials quality specifications, and we have manufacturing oversight for repairs and rebuilds. As a customer, I want the lowest cost, as do businesses in Ontario. When we plan for the future, our plans should focus on lowering these costs. And if you're in the energy selling business, lowering the cost of energy for consumers is bad for business unless the business can lower the production cost of energy. As the cost of green energy falls, some in the energy market face more competitive challenges. This competition results in lower revenues for more expensive energy generation. Solar energy is best positioned to become cheaper, but how much cheaper can we make nuclear? Well, not as much. Will Ontario's energy grid develop a winning strategy for customers or for its investors? We are in the business, are we in the business of supporting poor business models, or should we let the free market do its job? What Ontario seems to suffer, and America, is what I like to call the cheap landlord syndrome. I've witnessed firsthand cheap landlord syndrome in Ontario and America. These are the businesses that are too cheap or too lazy to innovate. Where the cheap landlord syndrome gets dangerous is when the cheap landlord changes laws to continue their weak and lazy business models. Cheap landlords will endlessly fight before spending one penny. And when we're planning large generation, these projects need long-term consideration and transparent analysis. It takes time to build and bring on new generation. Each technology has a cost profile, a maintenance profile, an infrastructure profile, such as transmission lines and substations for the larger centralized generation systems. But each also has a safety risk profile. The risks of each technology has a direct impact on the cost. And in the case of natural gas, we have pollution risks. In the case of nuclear, we have many risks. When we look at nuclear energy, we see a complex set of risks. The CANDU nuclear system is safe and reliable, but only if it's operated under strict conditions and regulations. When we compare nuclear energy to solar energy, we see that solar has a different risk profile. The risk profile for wind is also different, but both wind and solar are much simpler to operate. And what we quickly learn is that it takes complex analysis to fully understand the dynamics of a multi-source energy grid. When we add it all up, we want safe, low-cost, and reliable energy. And as I said, when Ontario lost design authority on energy strategy, Mike Harris assured voters that running Ontario's energy market more like a business was the better way to lower costs and improve performance. And if we look at Ontario's plan for nuclear energy, We hear about the benefits towards the climate and air pollution, but we don't see a lot of discussion on future costs or future competitiveness of this energy. If we look at other countries, we see that some are pulling the plug on nuclear energy. Germany has plans to pay companies to start decommissioning their nuclear power plants and diversifying their energy sources. Unlike most energy, nuclear cannot just be switched off. Nuclear sites are irradiated and require long-term phase-outs. Not many nuclear sites have been fully decommissioned yet, but the costs are high and the time frames are long-term. Germany has taken the lead in decommissioning because the cost of nuclear is too high to remain cost competitive in an open energy market. Germany is thinking ahead. In a decade, the cost of some green energy might be 1/10 the cost of nuclear energy. If we look south of the border, we see that nuclear energy operators are idling operations because they can't compete in their open market. They're turning it off. They can't make a profit. Why is Trump slapping import tariffs on solar panels? Do we need to ask why? Why did some of these companies fail to diversify their energy portfolio with green energy? Well, some are starting to invest in green, and others are aiming to exit more expensive generation in favor of cheaper, greener energy. Seeing global markets adapting, makes me wonder who is pulling the levers on Ontario's energy system. Closer vertical analysis of nuclear energy reveals that it is not emissions-free or pollution-free. The process of uranium mining and refining have emissions fingerprints and a carbon fingerprint, plus obviously the tritium spills into Lake Ontario. These things occur. There are many examples, but Darlington is just one. And if what we're planning on doing is, upgrading Darlington to operate for, the next X number of years. And Bruce Power is also, going to undergo the same refurbishment. And in 10 years' time, these will not be generating cheap electricity, but they will still have high expensive maintenance costs, security costs, risk costs, safety costs, all that stuff. If we look at, take a quick look at, Site C in British Columbia, the cost to produce the electricity is not competitive. And the same with Muskrat Falls and Newfoundland. They're talking about raising the rates to cover Muskrat Falls. When it first was proposed, this was going to lower energy prices. So the same sort of thing is happening with Darlington, right? Like, nuclear energy had its time, and nuclear energy is safe if it's operated ethically. And in a post-truth conservative world, I do not trust anyone to operate a nuclear facility or to regulate it or to oversee it or anything. So, how green energy was rolled out in the Green Energy Act, wasn't, it's not based on the performance of solar energy. It was based on how it was managed, how it was rolled out, and how the rules were set up, and I think, basically they should have taken a more year-by-year approach by adding, generation in the right places, because if you add the solar panel, 100 kilometers from a substation, it's actually going to cost money to get that energy to market. Each one of these technologies has benefits and, drawbacks. And if you don't correctly implement the technology, then it's not going to work in your favor. It might actually end up costing more. And, you know, as a green designer, I see this all the time. People with the best intentions going out and investing in green stuff, and in the end having it fail miserably because they didn't do it correctly. They didn't listen to the experts. They ignored, you know, the best practices. So they rolled this Green Energy Act out, and it was kind of a disaster the way that you know it was administrated, and you know it's a sad fact that you know this is the reality of the quality of implementation of evolving our energy grid. And now the rest of the, you know, around 2009, the world was touting Ontario solar, but it's basically been flatlined. It's almost dead because of, you know, how poorly this was rolled out. And these are the decisions that are being made by, you know, these decisions were impacted by the nuclear lobby or the fossil fuel lobby, because the cost of green energy, if it's correctly implemented, would basically be eating the lunch of both nuclear and natural gas in Ontario. You know, so in some ways, it was almost like it was set up in a plan to fail, or plan to not look as good as it could have, you know, basically throwing all the money out there and not really paying close attention to how well this new technology was being implemented. So I focus on Darlington because it's a big ticket item. You know, it's a $14 billion plus the current cost. $14 billion. I guess we could sell it to Justin Trudeau for $50 billion. But you know, in all seriousness, in the future, you know, that is only going to be a burden to ratepayers. The price of energy is going to go up for nuclear relative to the cost of green energy generation. And these sort of, you know, political battles over green energy and the ideology and this and that, you know, what we really need is a team mentality to make this stuff work. And everybody, you know, we've politicized all this stuff. And it leaves people like me and, you know, other, you know, experts in the field just shaking their head going, nobody, you know, who's doing this properly, you know, and it's not in Ontario. And I think that, you know, the only way it's going to get fixed is if we start wanting it to be fixed, because there are big forces at play that want these nuclear contracts, you know, big construction companies that are going to make a lot more money fixing up our nukes than if we considered, say, offshore wind energy. And there's been a ban on offshore wind energy in Ontario since, you know, we're going to be doing further studies. But if we look at other nations, such as, you know, Scotland, is reporting fantastic results with their offshore wind. But how that offshore wind is installed and operated also makes a difference. You know, if you go to Kingston, you can see windmills were placed on Wolfe Island. Well, Wolfe Island is a bird migration path, but you know, we need to be doing a better job at correctly applying these technologies so they benefit our economy and our environment. You know, so I said, you know, Darlington is one example. How will post-truth conservatism impact things like grassy narrows? How will post-truth conservatism deal with Sarnia's chemical alley? How will post-truth conservatism deal with Ontario's green belt? If we apply, the knowledge of science and the experts in all of these different fields, in the end, it's just going to be ignored by, this post-truth ideology, and the biggest bang for the buck is going to rule. And that we end up paying in the end. The taxpayer ends up paying in the end for all of these failed endeavors. And we talked about, banking in Canada quickly over email. And, some of these investments, even if it fails, the bank can walk away from this without losing a penny. So the people that are investing in these projects don't really have any skin in the game. So who are they going to invest in? Well, they're going to invest in, the ones that are going to make them the most money quickest. And when it comes to all of these concerns, we're just not getting the level of analysis to make informed decisions. So that is occurring in our federal government, that is occurring at the provincial level, but also in the media. The media is, has a huge part to play in this. And the way that privatization works is, they're hiding some of this information behind, closed doors. And we no longer have transparency that we had, before 1998. And another example of this with Mike Harris was with, the air ambulance, the helicopter, Orange. And Orange was privatized, and the people that operated it just spent 6 years in court for corruption. So, these things sound good on paper. The Energy Competition Act sounds great on paper. And when it was announced, I specifically said this is going to fail because of how businesses work. And we see all of the same, we see this cycle repeated again and again, where we're given a set of promises, and they never really deliver on the job, and the businesses walk away richer, and the taxpayer is left with the bill, right?
Well,
did you want to talk more about did you want to specifically talk about grassy narrows at all? That is a huge issue and concern.
No, I'm going to back it up from that yet. We're not even to grassy narrows yet. And
okay.
The big word that hits me out of that is politicized. That's the root of all these issues when you get to the core of them. And as you mentioned, the media's role, well, isn't it surprising that in this Ontario election last week and the determination of the Canadian corporate media to make sure the Liberal government is replaced in Ontario, today from Global News, Shaw Chorus, we have an exclusive about how the Liberals ignored advice on how to implement the Green Energy Act from all the experts that they had gathered to tell them how to implement it. But yet there was a political decision to go big or go home. Meanwhile, all the advice they got was specifically, as you said, let's go bit by bit, phase by phase, because if you dump all this on the market and sign contracts into the next century, that's going to be a huge dump on the market, and we're stuck with paying what we signed the contracts for. Guess who's going to pay it? The consumers. So the government made a political decision. The government made a political decision to look good and cost Ontario ratepayers billions of dollars. No other reason than politics. Now, something else, there's another common factor that has really emerged in post-truth conservatism when it comes to mega projects that government of the day is determined to sell. Because, as we said, we don't want data. That's not a plus for us. Darlington was another example. In January of 2016, when OPG came out with their unveiling of the Darlington refurbishment, which in 2016 had a budget of $12.8 billion. The news release said that it will add $15 billion to Ontario's gross domestic product and will create up to 11,800 jobs annually. The project, including all 4 reactors, will involve roughly 30 million hours of work over a decade, with the involvement of more than 180 companies. So we see this time and time and time again, overselling the numbers to manufacture consent. Now, it's amazing how the government will just accept these numbers without any scrutiny. But anybody who wants to bring up hard evidence not in favor of such a project, that's deemed maybe not so important. So, this is a $26 billion program to repair all the nuclear power in Ontario that will be footed at the end of the day by the government of Ontario. That's $26 billion in 2016. So it got underway, but again, post-fact, post-occurrence, October 2017, again from Global News, no friend of the Liberal government, they got their hands on a May 2014 report prepared by auditors that claimed initial cost estimates for some of the earliest projects at the refurbishment of Darlington, such as the heavy water storage and drum handling facility, were poorly characterized as part of a deliberate management strategy challenging contractors to keep bids low. So before they even brought their grand plan and told us about how many jobs it would create and how it would boost the GDP, they were already gaming their estimates. This is what can this be? What is this other than politics?
I've worked on huge projects, and the reality is that putting prices on things is not an easy thing to do, and it's basically a guessing game. There's no hard science to it. These are estimates, and the reality is that when it comes to making these estimates, the government's going to make estimates that make them look good, but also estimates that are eventually going to win the contract for the big companies doing the work. And that's I guess the moral of the story is that even these estimates that they're talking about now, in my project calculator, I would double that figure instantly because I know how complex these things are. And there was just a scientific or a report just came out of Germany that one simple delay in a nuclear power plant refurbishment can increase the cost by 20%. And these little hiccups and are unknowns. You don't know when you're going to be faced with some unknown challenge when you have to design something, and governments and accountants and they don't like the bad news. They need to sell the good news, right? And that's what it comes down to is, basically with the Darlington, I would expect the costs to double, and I would expect the costs for Bruce to double as well. These are all gamed estimates, to get everybody on board and to get everybody signing and to get, the ball rolling. And once that ball is rolling, then the games begin. And I've worked on projects where people play these games, and what started out as a $200 million project is suddenly a $500 million project. An example of this was when the United States initially released its F-35 program, and it was estimated at $200 billion to develop and design this advanced fighter. And, Trump just wrote $1 trillion check to the military. And, that initial $200 billion estimate I would bet it's around $2 trillion right now. And, the F-35 program is the height, is the cream of the crop of these private corporations. These things used to be done by the government, and they used to be done on schedule, mostly on schedule and mostly on budget. But now it's a field day, And I personally worked with one of the designers that designed components for nuclear power plants, and he said it was the best work ever. Everything was paid on time. If you did any overruns, it was paid immediately. There was basically an open checkbook to get the job done.
Well, the F-35 many times on this show has been called the all-time most successful corporate welfare program ever conceived and executed. So that's an extreme to pick because that's the top of the line. But the whole result of this 2 years before the fact, contractors being told to lowball, the result of this, just that one first early contract, a major one, but one of the first ones for Darlington's heavy water storage and drum handling, that was a 400% overrun on that one little piece at the start. I mean, there's your evidence right there. This is a consistency in this world. And, I saw it in the oil sands over and over and over, 200, 300% overruns by the time you're done. And yet they turn around and hire the same design teams for the very next one. This is something that happens far too often. Even with these nefarious activities going on, February of this year, Ontario Power Generation can proceed with the refurbishment of Darlington Unit 3 after receiving the go-ahead from the province's Ministry of Energy. They know about all this stupidity already on Unit 2. Oh, yeah, go ahead and start Unit 3. We're fine. This is obviously not based on result criteria. This is not based on science. It's not based on planning. It's based on this is what we're going to do. And, we can go back to the description on the show page. What's the point of science if we don't use it? Where's this going? I mean,
science is an inconvenient fact for some business models. And this is when I'm a straight shooter. And I'll walk into a meeting and say this is going to cost this much, and some people don't like to hear that.
And some people will say, well, can you just say it's going to cost this much and we'll just pay you? You know, because they've got as soon as they get that ball rolling, they just have to get the ball rolling. You know, it's like the LAV deal with Saudi Arabia. It's like, you know, you just have to get that ball rolling. And once you start that ball rolling, you know, it's game on, right? Like, you can't stop these things once they start, or else you're going to go to court and you're really going to get beat up. Like, you know, what would have been the legal outcome if Justin Trudeau said, no, we're not going to sell these, you know, LAVs to Saudi Arabia? Well, you know, buried deep inside these contracts are these penalty clauses and poison pills and blah, blah, blah. And if you know, put your foot down, there's fines involved, you know, contractual fines. Like, oh, if you pull out of this deal, you agree to pay, you know, $30 billion in damages, no questions asked. Sign here, done. So it's kind of like this, you know, it's contract, you know, the contractual details that you will never, ever, 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 ever see because they're shrouded in, you know, this, you know, trade secrets and all this bullshit. And you're just never going to know. And the people that are running, you know, the F-35 and all of these different programs, they're there to make money. They're not there to defend America. Like, you know, if, you know, and this is the real threat, is that Russia and China are laughing at the F-35 and all of this. You know, I want to use, you know, bad language, but the F-35, you know, these people are risking our national security. You know, you just can't really grasp, you know, the scope of importance of what some people are doing, the damage that they are doing. You know, China is eating our lunch on green energy. They are making tons of money making solar panels. They're making tons of money, and we're missing out on all these markets, you know, and we're mired in this, you know, where big business pulls the strings on what decisions are made and which projects are going to get rubber stamped and which aren't, you know.
Well,
you know, and you saw like the stuff in the oil sands, you know, a lot of those projects were backstopped by taxpayer. You know, it was guaranteed, you know, this is a sure thing. There's no way you're going to lose money. There's no way you're going to get sued. And they write these things into the contracts, you know, and it's, you know, the taxpayer is left holding the bag, you know, and I wanted to, I just want to say that, you know, it weakens our economy. It weakens our national security. And, you know, the Russians exploited post-truth conservatism in the last election. And they, you know, the conservatives have spent a good 20 to 30 years building this mountain of bullshit. And now the enemy is exploiting it. And, you know, conservatives won't even, you know, they're well past their due date. They can't even, you know, tell which way is up on all of this. It's ridiculous.
Well, the issue of undoing any progress that has been done for the greater good in the last generation and a half, post-truth conservatism has it firmly under attack. There's no better place to demonstrate that than the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Governor Scott Walker, who has had plenty of problems since he became governor in Wisconsin, they made national news when the Public Lands Agency, pretty minor office in the state administration, was able to take members of other departments of its own government to court, and they were successful in getting any references to climate change eliminated from any documentation out of the lands office. That was the start of something. Now, since 2011, Walker has moved to reduce the role of science in environmental policy making and to silence discussion of controversial subjects, including climate change, by all state employees. He's presided over a series of rollbacks in environmental protection, including relaxing laws governing iron mining and building on wetlands, in both cases to help specific companies avoid regulatory roadblocks. He's loosened restrictions on phosphorus pollution in state waterways, tried to restrict wind energy development, and proposed ending funding for a major renewable energy research program housed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, he's also cut severely into the budgets of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, which has responsibility for air and water quality. He proposed eliminating a third of the 58 science positions and 60% of its 18 environmental educator positions. Now, this is a pretty clear agenda, one that should be familiar to Canadians from the Stephen Harper administration, one that most Americans are in shock of, considering what Trump's doing in Washington. But what's the result of what Mr. Walker has been doing in Wisconsin? Who knows who Foxconn is? Foxconn is a global electronics giant based in Taiwan, mostly known as an assembler for Apple. Well, Governor Walker and Wisconsin have managed to lure Foxconn to Wisconsin with lots of promises going both ways. Foxconn getting tax breaks into the billions of dollars in a little more than a decade, promising again, what else? 13,000 jobs. But yet, for this massive Foxconn campus they wish to construct, they need 7 million gallons of water from Lake Michigan a day.
Mm-hmm.
And gee, this has got nothing to do with all the loosening of all the laws going on with Governor Walker and President Trump now. Oh, no, not at all. And there is an issue about the Great Lakes Compact, which is an agreement between 8 American states, Ontario, and Quebec. It includes the 5 Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is the largest drinking water basin on the face of the earth. And there are very, very specific borders around the Great Lakes about how far back you can go to take water from the Great Lakes, and it's allowed. Because, when getting ready for the show, I read that the annual replenishment for the Great Lakes is 1% of volume. So basically, it is a finite resource. And when somebody like Foxconn comes along and says they need 7 million gallons of water a day, that's over 30 million liters a day. And they pick a state that has these broken down laws and lacks enforcement, and are getting tax giveaways, and rules are getting broken because the issue here is half of the Foxconn campus is on the Mississippi side of the border. So they should be drawing raw water from the Mississippi River, not Lake Michigan. But, can't we have it from the lake? It looks like they're going to get it. So again, this is setting a very bad example. And in April, there was a piece by Tim Elementsiak in TVO, and it was why Ontarians should care about Wisconsin's water. And he lays the case out. And the problem is, if Foxconn gets away with this, it's precedent. And it will keep happening. And what are they going to do, right? Because then you're looking at lawsuits again. Well, you gave them water, you won't give us water. We'll see you in court. So where does the stupidity end?
Well, there's no end to stupidity.
But I mean,
right?
what can be done from, a citizen's viewpoint on this? This seems so entrenched in all jurisdictions. It seems to be a common thing all the time. I mean, we're going to talk about some of the bad things that have already happened. It's only a matter of time before there are more bad things when the rules get loosened and Taiwanese companies that manufacture for Apple, who 3 or 4 years ago were in the news because their employees were jumping off their buildings and they had to put nets up to prevent their employees from committing suicide. Mega, what would be Superfund sites in Taiwan, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in China, from companies like Foxconn. How big is the risk? If they're taking 7 million gallons in, they're also dumping back in as well. So where's the regulation and enforcement going to be on a electronics manufacturer who by stock uses mercury, tungsten, magnesium? What's the risk to the Great Lakes of all things?
The saddest part of this whole discussion is that, using science, we can accomplish, manufacturing all of these things ethically. If we use the science that we have, then we can avoid polluting the air and the water. You mentioned the water in the Great Lakes Basin. We also have stress from companies that pump water out for bottled water.
Yes.
In Michigan, in certain parts of Michigan, the water table has dropped, in some years, and they're really starting to worry that, people extracting this water, is going to affect the lake levels. And what a lot of people don't realize is that majority of the water in the Great Lakes is from glaciers. And, the deepest part of most of the Great Lakes, except for Lake Erie, is actually below sea level. There's a lot of water there, but most of it is ancient. And, we kind of think, oh, yeah, we get a heavy snow, we get a heavy rain, and it'll be fine. But really what it boils down to is, companies that are out for themselves and don't want to pay the price to do things ethically. And as, Trump is trying to reshore manufacturing and get jobs back into America, the companies that are playing along with this game are saying, well, we don't have these regulations in this other place. Like, we can't do that. And they basically dictate the terms and conditions. That's what, when I said that at the top of the show, is that the corporations, dictate the terms and conditions on these huge mega projects. And it's either you jump through the hoop or I'm going to the next state. And that's the way things are starting to happen. You see like companies like, where should we locate our next head office? And they get all these people competing. And, in some situations, it's like, well, who's going to weaken, their regulations, or who's going to, lower the taxes, or even we don't even pay taxes for 10 years, or, they just keep sweetening the pot. And in the end, it actually ends up costing more. But in the grand scheme of things, the bankers and the rich executives and, the industry groups, they get what they want. But, the taxpayer and the voter are left holding the bag, 60% of manufacturing areas in China are too toxic for human survivability. And, there's a lot of what we're talking about tonight has been covered by, Frontline on PBS. And they go through and they cover all of this quite well. And, I wonder if, Frontline is going to survive Trump sometimes, these journalists and investigative journalists, we used to have some in Canada, and that is all gone, and we look at the CBC now, and of course they've changed the management, they've changed the executive board, but I don't really see any changes. What would really give me confidence in the CBC is if they hired 100 investigative journalists and gave them all the lawyers they could ever point a stick at and tell them to go do their jobs. And, that is a huge threat to companies because it exposes them to lawsuits, and these companies, they have to pay damages in the court of law. Of course, they can go to business or transfer funds or blah, blah, blah. There's a million games to play. But in the end, we get the short end of the stick. And it's really not a formula that's working out well for America or Canada. And I think, there are some great corporations, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of really, really entitled, lazy corporations. I call them the lazy landlord syndrome. I walked into many companies during the 90s and the 2000s, the early 2000s in Ontario, and basically just knew that these people were going to go to business because they didn't want to spend the money to lead. They didn't want to, make the effort to hire the people, to do the work, to actually become a world leader. And we look to other countries, and some of these countries are eating our lunch. There's European companies that are coming in and making lots of money in North America. And meanwhile, our companies are sitting on their butts, wondering where the next paycheck's coming from, and, has really lost all competitive edge or competitive drive, and it results in a weak economy.
Well, when you talk about we know who always gets the stick, I believe it's time to mention some who have gotten a stick far worse than almost all others. And the case I want to talk about is Grassy Narrows. And back in 1962, Reed Paper upstream started dumping mercury into the river system. In the 1990s, the Ontario government was aware of the contamination that had happened, but sat on that information. It's now been more than 50 years since that happened. There have been complaints and documented evidence, and it reminds me of how big tobacco used to behave. Well, we're studying that, and we're concerned. It's just like cell phones don't cause brain cancer. We're studying that. That's all they ever had to say. But there's been a study that came out just this past week, and the results are very clear. I don't really know what can be done at this point besides completely relocating First Nation. I don't know. But the survey found that there are fewer elders in Grassy Narrows compared to First Nations everywhere else. So dying prematurely. Higher rates of suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts. Adult residents who reported eating more fish as children had experienced lower levels of success in school and have higher rates of nervous system symptoms and disorders. Adults who reported eating fish several times a week when they were children have mercury exposure from fish consumption contributes to poor neurological development. It's clear evidence that the physical and mental health of the Grassy Narrows community is poorer than that of other First Nation communities in Canada and Ontario. Now, this cannot be understood without taking into account their history of mercury poisoning and its consequences. So the evidence is clear. They use many models comparing people in certain times, certain years, what ages they were, how much fish they ate, if their parents worked in the fish industry, which that's another thing too. This eliminated the entire economic system for Grassy Narrows. They depended on that fish and that river system not only for their sustenance, but as a means to sell the fish. Of course, nobody will touch the fish. They haven't for decades. So they don't have jobs. They don't have anything else to eat for the most part. How are these people ever going to get out of this cyclone, I mean, and yet what's to be done for them? Now that the study's done, what is the government going to do?
Yeah. It breaks my heart,
And how did this happen, though? Because things were known, nothing was done, nothing was said, nobody was punished, and now this is the result. So this is even before the current culture. What can we expect to be hearing about in 20, 30 years from now, from what we have today?
Yeah,
that's the question.
There's no undo button for some of this stuff, and I'm involved in manufacturing, and there are real consequences to not addressing these issues. Grassy Narrows, I've been tweeting about Grassy Narrows for years now, and the Kathleen Wynne government decided to make an announcement and at least start talking about it or recognizing it. But what can be done? It's like, well, nothing can be done. And the true tragedy of this is the company that did this pollution years and years and years ago. I remember looking up, and they made $30 billion in revenues in 2015. And they have walked away. And this is the reality of ignoring science and ignoring regulation and ignoring corporate responsibility. What can we do for mercury poisoning? And the answer is nothing. We can't do. There's no magic wand that's going to ever fix this. Do they all have to be relocated? Probably. And the thing about mercury damage, the neurological damage, is that science doesn't fully understand if, future generations.
Okay, what happened as Graham just dropped, so I'm going to have to get him back in. Hang on. And I have to find his phone number. There it is. Okay. Wow, this is lovely. Just almost made it to 2 hours. Hang on, I'll get him back. Okay. Yes. How to add call. Okay. Hope everyone's enjoying the silence. Come on, answer. Okay, merge.
Leave your name and number. I'll give you a call right back. Thanks. Bye.
Oh, no, Graham,
After leaving
no.
a message, you can hang up or press pound for more
I caught his
options.
answering machine. Oh, well. I don't know what to do now if I can't get him back on the phone. God damn. Well, that's it. I scrapped it. I hung up. Oh, well, we didn't get the big ending. I'm not going to bother again. If for some reason I got his answering machine, maybe he was trying to call back. Regardless, unfortunate, but I'm not going to waste 3 minutes now to get him back on for 2 minutes of live air. We did get through most of what we wanted. What we didn't get to is Graham was going to address what are the ways forward, what changes can be made, what is science doing that is not being recognized. I think if you listen to the content tonight, you can get what we would be saying with the denial and suppression of real science that does not give the answers that fit the environment. It seems to be far too easy to simply discard them and make stuff up. Friends of science, etc. Bummer ending, but whatever. I'm going to let it go. That was Graham Chivers. You can see him on Twitter at @DeepGreenDesign. GrahamsGreenDesign.com. Is there a viable environment or economy with post-truth conservatism? Well, you tell me. As I said, how many more grassy narrows are in our future? I don't know. Thank you, Graham. Sorry the show ended before we could finish. That's it for tonight. Next week, June 6th, night before the Ontario election. That's what it'll be all about. I expect to have Dave Glover back, maybe some more guests. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here. Good night.